Okay, good morning, everyone. Good to see you. Very impressive. You pulled yourselves away from unwrapping your presents at the fireplace to come and talk about money. Very, very nice. Okay. Our topic today, and Be'ezus Hashem next week, is the topic of money and contemporary Jewish life. I'm not a very cultured person, but I would like to begin by quoting for you from the beginning of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. And by the way, that's Dickens' own editing. That was not me editing. A Tale of Two Cities. The presence of polar opposites. When it comes to the subject of money in our time and money in Orthodox Jewish life, I think we can fairly say that it's the best of times and it's the worst of times. Orthodox Jewish life costs a fortune. A fortune. Try to think about, and I'm sure you always do, the perfect storm of larger families, higher real estate costs. Remember, we have to live in our neighborhoods, location. The price of kosher food, the specific costs of food and clothing for Shabbos and Yontiv, Simchas, and of course, the elephant of tuition, private school education. Private school education, which in the world at large is reserved for the wealthy and people of means, but for us, private school education is our public school. And it's a little bit expensive. Everything comes at a price. And it's very, very, very intense, very, very expensive. There was a fellow remaining anonymous, who around Rosh Hashanah time wrote about how he was going to bail out, or he had bailed out, of communal Jewish life because of all of these expenses, was going to try to use the online Chabad Cheder model in order to be able to educate his children, and just try to some degree to go it alone in order to be able to build up some savings, which is a very difficult thing usually for people with tons of expenses to be able to do. The challenge of living with the chronic financial pressure that all of this involves for a very large segment of our community is overwhelming. Many people cannot make ends meet, and even if people, so to speak, are making ends meet, but the chronic financial pressure is emotionally exhausting. It saps oftentimes people's simchas hachayim, their joie de vivre, their joy in life, and can have a tremendous impact on family life, on shalom bayis, and so on and so forth. In that sense, one could call it, so to speak, not such good times. And on the other hand, have we ever experienced a time where Jews were having such a good time? Where we had so much. It's incredible It's incredible the level of specifically Orthodox Jewish luxury which exists in the world. Open up a magazine, a frum, glossy, beautifully produced magazine, and look at the advertisements. Don't ever quote me as saying that I told you to open up one of those magazines and look at the advertisements. This is purely for a sociological exercise. All right? But open them up and take a look and see what it looks like. And you see that how can we speak about a community that's suffering, that's financially strapped, when in between the articles about people pulling their hair out of financial issues, all we find is the presence of, the promotion of new possibilities in terms of what we're able to have. And the amount of wealth, bli ayin hara, the amount of wealth that is present in the Orthodox Jewish community is also, again, I'm not a historian to be able to compare what it was like in Spain before the Inquisition. I don't know. But it's astounding. Astounding. If we can't use the word unprecedented, it's astounding. So it's the best of times, and it's the worst of times. And unfortunately, it would be really a lot easier if it was a tale of two cities, but it's a tale of one city. It's a tale of one bench in shul or one row in school, which is what makes it sometimes inordinately difficult. Now, if one lives perhaps in a community which is not joined together because people want to daven in a shul on Shabbos, so then usually the way communities would sort of be structured, I mean, not always, but often the way communities are structured is people who can afford to live in really nice houses, so they live in this area, and they send their schools to those schools, and people who can't afford it, they live in a different area, and they send their schools to those schools. And rarely the twain shall meet. Their social lives, their general, their children, they're not just like constantly interacting with each other. But in our community, the rich and the not so rich, we're all together. We're all together in the same shuls and the same schools. We're all together. And the contrasts, the pressures which are created as a result are enormous. They're enormous, and there's something for us to consider. Now, the idea of having to really sacrifice financially for Jewish life is not new. It may have a new flavor today, but it's not new. In Kriya Shema, we speak about serving God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your possessions. B'chol me'odecha. Right? Person would give up all that they have, all their money, for being able to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When we think of it as the Nesaya and the challenge, for example, of the Jews who came to America 80, 90 years ago. And the stories of people who came and they had to make a living. They were running away from poverty to the Golden Medina, to America with all that it promised. But the promises didn't look the same from up close as they had looked from far away. And people got jobs in sweatshops and factories and all kinds of things. And we all know the stories, we've heard them many times, about the heroes. Literally the heroes who were all sitting here because of those heroes, who Friday afternoon, their boss said to them, "I'll see you tomorrow, right?" And he said, "No, it's Shabbos." And he said, "Well, if I don't see you tomorrow, then don't bother coming in on Monday." And there were those heroes who rose to the challenge for the sake of their Yiddishkeit, and they lost their job. They lost their job every weekend. Every weekend. They had to start again the next week, and if they were even able to. And the horrible poverty which they endured in order to be able to make it. And the difficulty, the sapping of joie de vivre, of simchas hachayim, the effect on shalom bayis, the period which perhaps created the modern iteration of that expression which we try so hard to avoid of, is schwer zu sein a Yid. It's hard to be able to be a Jew, to be able to live and practice as a Jew. That was one version, a version of one time of b'chol me'odecha, of severe financial sacrifice for the sake of being Jewish. Today, we have our own version of b'chol me'odecha, of having to serve God with all your possessions, with tremendous, tremendous financial dedication. It's not getting fired. It's not about getting fired. It's about working and working and working and working and stopping on Friday afternoon, sometimes only to start again on Motzei Shabbos or on Sunday morning, and still not having enough. And while we may not have the Nisayon of Shabbos, but people will start, they do these surveys, and they say there was a survey which was done of the modern Orthodox Jewish community, whatever that means, the Nishma survey, which was released in the late summer, where I think 97% of respondents spoke about the cost of Jewish education as the critical challenge of American Jewish life. And if I'm not mistaken, 17% spoke about considering alternatives to sending their kids to Jewish school. That's a number which perhaps is true in some parts of the community, less true in other parts of the community, but it's a presence. It's something which people think about. And maybe it's not as cut and dried as Shmiras Shabbos. But all these things, all these elements, all of these costs of being able to maintain Jewish life and communal life are indeed very significant, and they are a different iteration. They're a different iteration of the kind of financial challenge, which is uniquely the financial challenge of trying to live a Jewish life. So it is our version at this point in time. So we have to ask ourselves how we're supposed to deal with financial stress, with poverty. We have to ask ourselves how we're supposed to deal with wealth and prosperity. We have to ask ourselves, how do we deal with both of these challenges, coexisting literally side by side in our communities, anywhere that we are. Now, in talking about this challenge, we could have a number of different agendas. We could talk about macro issues like, okay, so how are we going to solve the education crisis, the funding of education crisis? It's the word which people like to use. I'm not a tremendous fan of the word crisis. We've been hearing about this in crisis and so on and so forth, and we have a little bit of a faith that Oray Noisei Es Noisav, that we have to figure out how, and we have to figure out how to make it softer and easier, but Be'ezus Hashem, the show will go on, and we will be able to continue this way. But it is certainly a huge challenge that needs tremendous amounts of attention to be able to address, and we can sit and we could talk about it. The problem with trying to address that here around this table is first of all, the best minds dedicated to Klal Yisrael on this side of the ocean, many of whom I've spent time, speaking to, hearing from, have dedicated a tremendous, and continue to dedicate a tremendous amount of their time, their effort, their ideas in order to be able to figure out how to crack that, how to solve that problem. It's not a problem which lends itself simply to solutions. I get ideas from people all the time about it, and one thing which we do have to realize, which is a sobering reality, is that in the Jewish community, in our community, we are not in a position to legislate change. Someone will come up with a formula about how if we taxed the community, so the community would be funding Jewish education, not just the users, not just the parents, as it really should be to a significant degree. It could be done, and what you do is just take all the houses and index, the real estate values and assess people according to the value of their homes, or put a tax on the butcher shops, or whatever else it is, different ways to be able to do it. We can't legislate. There's no one that I know of who's in a position to be able to do that. There's no community that's listening to forced assessments of taxes within the Jewish community. We're not in European communities, which had, some of which still have, a government-empowered Jewish community that's able to do these things. So people work and they try to figure out creative ways to motivate the community to fund more with their discretionary funds. A very, very valuable exercise, worthy of discussion. Pursuit of government funds, which is a huge effort which goes on all the time, and a worthy effort, not without its own challenges, not without its own pitfalls, trying to think of ways to be able to save money. These are all worthy exercises. They're all worthy exercises, and perhaps a subject for further discussion, for a different discussion. Somebody asked me how I'm dividing up the talk this week and next week, and to some degree, the way I'm dividing it up remains to be seen, because I want to hear after today's talk. Okay, so where should we go from here? What should we discuss subsequently? And your ideas hopefully will be heard, will be shared, and we'll do it. One thing I can be sure of is that we're not going to be able to cover the subject fully today. We can talk about, with the recognition that a lot of money is needed in order to be able to live Jewish life. So we could talk about the hashkafa, about the approach we should take to how much of our lives should be dedicated to making money and making more money. It's a worthy question. We sometimes, preach austerity. We want to put aside time to be able to study Torah and to be involved in all kinds of other things. But if so much money is needed, so then maybe we need to be thinking about, so what is the approach? What truly is the approach? How much of one's life, one's time, one's energy should be focused on this fundamental need? Being able to maximize one's income potential. What I would like to focus on today, however, is where I think the action is on some level. I think the action is because it's hard to redo the macro by trying to redo the macro. In anything that we approach in life, what we have before us is that which is in our hands. Specifically, that which is in our hands as individuals, as families, to be able to do, to be able to accomplish. It might sound like this is the sort of, chickening out of the big issues. Again, we have no problem having a discussion on, God willing, on any level and every level, happy to have productive discussion. But in a significant sense, the buck starts and stops. And perhaps that's exactly the right term to use. The dollar stops and starts with us as individuals, where we are, how we choose to react to these, whether stresses or opportunities, the polar opposites, the tale of two cities, the tale of two extremes, the best of times, the worst of times, how we're supposed to be dealing with this and managing finances and dealing with the decisions of life in this realm as to how we approach it. And in a great sense, social science would tell us that if we can approach this with a real paradigm shift, as we do as individuals, that is what accomplishes real change. There's a famous book which was written by Malcolm Gladwell called The Tipping Point, where he speaks about how trends take over societies, how things become a rage, a fad, a direction, that everybody suddenly is doing it. Not something which anybody legislated, not something which was created by law, mandated, but the thing to do. It's a fascinating book about how if you find the right people and the right people start to do it, he defines mavens, connectors, and salesmen, three different kinds of people who carry great influence in the choices which they make as individuals, then it becomes, using 21st century terms, viral. Everybody wants to do it. If that's what they're doing, then everybody wants to do it. And we see that all the time. In fact, as we're going to discuss as we go along, sometimes, of course, that's a big part of the problem which we face, is those kinds of viral trends from thought leaders. So when we talk here today, and what I'd like to focus on is primarily what we would be able to do, speaking to a group of people, each of whom is dealing within this world at one end of it or the other, what we can do to be able to manage it. And if it will just be to be able to manage things for ourselves alone, it would be a good and healthy and positive thing. But we can also have an eye to recognizing that if we can somehow develop a different kind of an attitude towards some of the issues and challenges and opportunities that we have before us, who knows? Maybe in some wild-eyed dream and with a lot of hope and prayer, it would be able to become a new trend and a different trend. I want to start into the guts of it, so to speak, by sharing with you an insight that I read once from Rabbi Aryeh Ginsburg on the Five Towns. He wrote something once which stuck with me very strongly. Excuse me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol niyeh b'dvarei. He wrote once an article where he spoke about the different kinds of problems which he confronts in trying to help people in his role as a congregational rabbi. And he tried to analyze the numbers, dividing them up into the following two categories: God-made problems and man-made problems. God-made problems and man-made problems. There are a lot of health issues, for example, that, where did that come from? A God-made problem. And then there are, I believe in God, you understand, please don't take this the wrong way, but there are also man-made problems. You know, a person smokes a pack of cigarettes every day, and then lo and behold, you know, the warning on the package comes true. Lo yaleinu Rahman al-Itzlan. Right? So, you know, it's a problem. It throws his life into turmoil, throws his family's life into turmoil, and everything else. But that's a problem which was created by the person. It wasn't created, so to speak, by fate that came from heaven. One invited, so to speak, that fate. Shalom bayis, marital harmony problems. A lot of those, general family difficulties, a lot of those are completely man-made issues. If we would work better, we would do better, we could perhaps have addressed a lot of those man-made problems. So, you know, lots of times people are sitting and saying, why did God do this to me? And we have to think about, why are we doing this to ourselves? Why are we doing this to ourselves? And this is not for the sake, I'm not here for the sake of saying, ugh, look what we're doing to ourselves, look what we're doing to ourselves. We have to recognize that because so much, I mean, his figure after he finished calculating and trying to review his appointments was like upwards of 85% from what I remember were man-made problems as opposed to God-made problems that he was dealing with all the time. And it's not a crazy number. But it's also something which should, therefore, we should turn around and say, here we are, we sit, and we think that we're like helpless victims of this combination of circumstances that are going on around us. You know, we're at the mercy of this and of that and of the other. And if instead we realize, we stop and we think what we ourselves can do to make the situation different, to make the situation better, it's a very important, extremely important and fundamental paradigm shift. So what I would like to do here today, in trying to deal with what we can do about this situation, is I want to very quickly review, and I say review, for some people, I'll probably be saying it to them for the first time, but for some people here, this is we try to speak about financial issues and managing, creating a healthier financial situation for ourselves periodically. Usually it's not recorded. Usually it's something which happens on Shabbos. And I would like to review some of the core points, which again some of you have heard numerous times before, and bring them to application, perhaps in a different way than before, or in a focused way. Usually, when speaking about financial issues, there are four fundamental points which I like to make, which I think are four fundamental points. The first one, we're not really going to be talking about today at length. We talked about it on another one of these legal holidays. The first one is that a person has to approach. We are Jews. We approach things with posech es yodecho masbiel chocha ratzoin, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that God provides. A Jew approaches financial issues with a belief in God. And the practical application of that is, of course, that we don't make financial efforts that God could not possibly approve of. That's the integrity discussion that we've had at other times, which we're not going to talk about today, despite the fact that for other contemporary reasons, very, very recent contemporary reasons, it's a very tempting subject to address. But we will not speak about that. Instead, we'll speak and focus on the other three. The first is that we have to, the healthiest thing for a person to do is to live within their means. The Rambam writes in Hilchos Deos that when he writes about the proper way for a person to conduct themselves is that a person has to use, again, the contemporary expression, a person must live within their means. A person has to have the sense of understanding, of confidence, to know this is what I can afford, and I'm going to spend, and I'm going to live within that. I live amongst others. They can afford more. God bless them. Let them enjoy what they can afford. I can afford something different. Well, God has blessed me too, and I'm going to live within that which it is that I can afford. A person, every person, has to learn this as a core principle of life. We must live within our means. Again, you want the quotation, we could read to you briefly what the Rambam writes in Hilchos Deos. Never gets, in my opinion, it should never get old and should never get tired. Talmid Chacham mechalkel dvarav b'mishpat. Oichel v'shoyse v'zones anshe beisai kafim emoinoi v'hatzlachasai. He eats, he drinks, and he supports his family according to his finances and his success. He should not overburden himself. Our sages instructed as a way of conducting ourselves. Shelo yochal adam basar ela l'teyavon. A person should not eat meat other than l'teyavon, if they really feel like they want to. Dai lebori lechol basar mi'erev Shabbos le'erev Shabbos. A healthy person could get by with meat once a week. If he's wealthy enough to do it, to eat more often, to eat daily, he can. Tzivu chachamim v'amru, but the chachamim instructed and said, La'olam yochal adam pachas min aroi lo lefim amaynai. A person should feed themselves less than what they can afford. Don't do all you can. Do less than you can. V'yilbash karoilai. Dress according to what you can afford. V'yechabed ishto yubanav yoser min haroilai. And he should treat his wife and his children a little bit more than he could afford. He should stretch a bit in order to do that. And the Rambam goes on to speak about the responsible sequence of creating a framework which is financially sustainable, that the continuation of the Rambam is very different than the way our own economies, our personal economies are set up. And it's a subject for a different discussion. But clearly, what we're after, the Derech Eretz, is prudence. Know your means, know, so to speak, your budget, set it, and live within it. Number two, Chazal spoke so strongly about what happens if you don't live within your means. So how do you do it? 21st century, right? How many credit card applications are you going to get in the mail this week? Right? One printed on thicker envelopes and paper than the next. It used to be easy. You used to get these credit card applications and you just rip them up for safety and throw them in the garbage. Now you have to do weight training in order to be able to tear up some of those, some of those envelopes. And they're people. You live beyond your means. You dip into savings if you have any. You put them on credit cards if you have any. And amongst the midos, Rabbi Yochanan Zaka asked his students to go and look at a thing to avoid. So one of them said to choose and to avoid. One of them said to be roes hanolad, to anticipate the future, and to avoid being lo v've'ena mashalim, to avoid borrowing money that we're not able to pay back. And that's always a second point which we like to make, which is critical. Credit cards are not for borrowing money. They're not for borrowing money for a person who wants to run their family properly. Okay, so sometimes it's helpful not to walk around with cash. You put on your credit card what you can pay at the end of the month. If you're not going to be able to pay it in full at the end of the month, it becomes very, very quickly a disaster. Sorry again, Rabbi Brul is sitting here. How many times a week are you dealing with this? Right? It's constant. It's a constant issue. The United States government is setting a wonderful example for the rest of us. Right? This is just the way it is. We live with deficit spending. In Manhattan, there's a federal government deficit clock. That shows how many, the trillions of dollars, how they're adding and growing like every minute. Now, we could have one of those in our kitchen. Many people have one of those in our kitchen. How it's growing and growing and growing and growing. Okay, so this month I had to do $300 that I can't pay, and next month it's $500 that I can't pay, and plus it's going to be, the usurious interest rate that it grows and grows and grows, and it's a lack of foresight. We must not do that. It's important to note the following. I shared this recently. The Chovos Halvavos taught that when Adam sinned in Gan Eden, so the consequence that the verse speaks out, and over many verses, is that as a result of man sinning and eating from the tree of knowledge, he would have to work very hard in order to make a living. And the Chovos Halvavos, one of our classic works of Hashkafa philosophy, says, why was that the consequence? And he explains that when man ate from the tree of knowledge, what man created within themselves, what man demonstrated within themselves was that they weren't making choices necessarily based on the right thing. If something was attractive and looked delicious and wonderful and enticing, they would go for it, even though it wasn't the right thing. Even though God said, don't eat that fruit, but I can't help it. It looks too good. And so, the Chovos HaLevavos says, God didn't give a person a punishment that they have to work hard. He gave them a solution that they have to work hard. Why? Because when you have to work hard to get something, every time you go to get something, you have to make a decision. It's a hard decision. I want to have that. It's very nice. But to have that, I have to expend, I have to invest a lot. Do I want it that badly? You put a kid in a candy store and say that it's on the house, go ahead, take it, so then he's going to be a kid in a candy store. You put the kid in a candy store and you say, you can get whatever you can afford. For every 10 dishes that you wash this week, you have 25 cents to spend here in the candy store. Okay, you can get what you want, and I'll take it back with me, and as you wash 10 dishes, I'll give you 25 cents worth. The kid's not going to come out with their pockets brimming over. And if they do, or if you come out with your pockets brimming over from what they put in your pockets as a result, they're not going to make draws on it. They have to make a decision. You have to make a decision, so then you have to do it. And the world of living on loans, living on especially credit cards where you don't even have to ask anybody, you don't have to go to a bank to make the case. It's just, you just do it until it gets refused, is the world where you don't have to make a decision. You don't have to make a decision before you decide to have something, before you decide to ring up a bigger grocery bill, or replace the carpet, or whatever else it is. I don't have to have the money to do it, I'll do it, and then I'll figure it out later. It is part of the challenge, the disaster of spending. And the third piece, so number one is live within our means, number two is don't borrow, and number three is very much related to number one especially, which number two is an outgrowth of number one. Live within your means, don't borrow to overcome those means. And number three is be motivated by yourself. Don't be motivated by others. Don't try to keep up with anyone. The most sobering line in the Mesilas Yesharim, again to me, the most sobering line in the Mesilas Yesharim is as follows. Hakavod hu hadochek es lev adam yoser mikol hatshukos v'hachemdos sheba'olam. Honor is the greatest motivator of people more than any other desire in the world. Without it, kfar hayada misratza lechol mashayuchal. People would eat whatever. Lilbosh mashiachas ervaso, to dress however. Lishkon bebayis shetastireu min hapegoyim. Live in a house that just keeps the cold out. V'haya parnasaso kala olav. They wouldn't have to work so hard. V'lo haya tzarech lisyageh lahashir klal. If we would live simpler, we wouldn't have to work so hard, he wrote. But, writes Elishilavilti ra'os atzmo shafal upachos mirev. But how can I live like that when everybody else doesn't? We must realize the tale of one city, the best of times and the worst of times. How difficult it is for us to really be just focused on that which is ours. And as a result, we end up assuming upon ourselves huge levels of responsibility, of obligations, of things that we feel that we have to have just because of that. Like we could imagine, if we were alone somewhere, that we might make do with less. And it's a tremendous issue that's going on all the time. the mavens, connectors, and salesmen are driving a special new kind of a car, so then suddenly everybody needs to drive that car. The mavens, connectors, and salesmen are building a nicer house, adding to the house, redecorating the house, hiring an interior designer to be able to decorate their house, and suddenly nobody is able to just go to the store and choose paint colors on their own anymore. Everything changes because someone else is able to do it. It's not just our kids who come home from school and say, but everybody has one, which means, as you know, 2 people. We do the same. We move in the same directions. So, old stuff. What can we do? What must we do ourselves to be able to address it? What's in our hands in terms of dealing with this? And what I'd like to say here applies whether we have plenty or we have less than plenty. We must build within ourselves this simple feeling, which is hard to accomplish, of satisfaction. Ezehu ashir hasameach bechelko. The wealthy person is the person who is satisfied, a person who has satisfaction. The other week we were talking in shul about the fact that when Paro had his dream, he saw these cows and they looked so happy. And Rashi says they looked so happy and they looked so good to each other because these were the years of Sova, these were the years of plenty. And everybody's ba'achu, everybody's in brotherhood with plenty. But yet we know that when people live in big fancy neighborhoods, they're not necessarily so happy and they're not necessarily filled with brotherhood. But as Rashi really explained, as the verse says, these are not years of plenty. These were years of Sova. Sova means years of satisfaction. A person could have a lot and not be satisfied, and a person can have little and be satisfied. We as adults and our children are too much stuck on we have to have this or that in order to be happy. I know this is a simple idea that we know of all the time and very well, but can we live it? Can we practice it? And I'm not talking about really being miserable, but let's say that we're happy. I'm talking about formulating for ourselves a genuine sense of happiness. When people are themselves managing with little, but they can't create a mood, an atmosphere around them in their homes of happiness. And their happiness because they can make do with little, because they know if they're going to have to do more, they'd have to work more, or they can't work more and they can't make more, and therefore they're going to be very happy with this in this situation. It's not enough. It's not enough. One has to be able to create, to generate genuine happiness around the atmosphere which one has in their house. Whatever the situation. I understand, of course, some situations make it very, very difficult for people to be happy. We can't imagine that we're in another place. But very often, I feel more often than not, when we are in situations where happiness is very much the possibility, we're still focused more on the items than on the happiness. On being able to have the things than being able to have the feeling that's created internally of simcha, rather than getting something more to be able to feed it. The primary teaching of that great Mishnah in Pirkei Avos of Ezu Asher Asameach Bechelko and so on, everything else down the list is that our satisfaction is up to us, to how we react to our circumstance, how we deal with what we have, rather than trying always to bring in things from the outside that either we can bring in or we don't even have a chance of bringing in, and thinking and building in a way that those are the tickets to our happiness. So Simply stated, not simply accomplished. Create happiness in a home not always built on the next project, the next acquisition that we can or cannot have, but to genuinely be satisfied. We can't do it when it comes to what our children want if we don't do it when it comes to what we want for ourselves. It's a behavior that we have to model, and we have to realize when we're not doing it successfully, because there are unfortunately many disenchanted children who come from homes where there wasn't enough, there was austerity, and the children felt very deprived. Children felt very deprived. And all the lessons that we can say to ourselves as, I'm going to be happy with my lot, are something we can never say to someone else. Rav Yisrael Salanter famously taught that when it comes to midas, whether it is faith in God, whether it is humility, whether it is being satisfied with little, that is something that we do for ourselves. When somebody comes to us and they need our help, we say, no, you don't need that much. You should be satisfied with little, and we give them little. We don't do that. That's not what the Torah tells us to do. The Torah tells us to do the opposite. You have to give them what they feel that they're lacking. But you know what the greatest gift is? To be able to give them the capacity to enjoy what they have, and then they'll be lacking much less. Lacking much less. To teach ourselves how we're able to enjoy together. It is critical when it comes to this kind of a thing for families, therefore, to be on the same page. Families have to be on the same page as much as possible. Sometimes we can sit down and discuss it and figure it out and say, hey, this is what we need, this is what we should have, this is what we can't have, and then work strategically to enjoy it together. Sometimes people come from very different spots, from very different attitudes, and it's very hard for them to be able to somehow get on the same page. And that requires work, it requires working together, it requires respectful conversation and discussion, and excellent role modeling. We can't, again, put anything down, someone else's throat when it comes to this stuff, because then we're not able to create joy, satisfaction as something for itself. Now, the second thing about the idea of living within our means and not borrowing money is again a practical piece, a practical application is to and this is for everyone. And the people who have less, to speak to them about savings, which is what I would like to discuss, is much harder. But this is really a rule, a very, very important rule for those who, Baruch Hashem, are blessed with more. I've shared with you before on one of these legal holidays what the Chafetz Chaim wrote when the Gemara teaches that a person should not give away more than 20% of their income. Why? Shema yitztorech labrios, because one day they might need others. Says the Chafetz Chaim, the presumption of the Gemara is that the person is saving the money that they have, saving their extra money, not spending. If a person is spending besides for their tzedakah, pretty much, or the vast majority of their money, besides for their tzedakah, there's no limit to the amount of tzedakah that they should give. The point of the Gemara is, if you want to put something away for the future, it's reasonable for you to want to put something away for the future and not give away more than 20%. You have the right to save something for yourself. The assumption is an assumption of savings. For a person to max out the money which they make when there's discretionary room there is very irresponsible, because what happens is things go up and things go down. the way business goes today is not the way business is always going to be. And if we live according to what we afford and we don't put away money for the future, so then if we have even a slight downturn, we don't know what to do. We're lost. The impact of creating that kind of a culture, which allows and creates a framework for even the more prosperous amongst us, those who are doing well amongst us, to be living closer to the rest of us, because they have a significant focus on putting away money for the future. It's healthy. It's healthy for anybody at every level. Now, I have children, Baruch Hashem, we have children who are young married. They're all learning in Kollel. And I told them, you have to be making enough money to put away money from day one. Because, Be'ez Hashem, you want to build families. And I said 100 times, it's not a surprise when a child turns 13 that they need to have a bar mitzvah. A bar mitzvah is not a surprise party. You have to put away money from the beginning. We all hope one day to retire. Social Security may or may not exist at that point in time, but certainly it's not enough. We have, Be'ez Hashem, fat years and lean years. And the lean years are the years where where we don't want to work anymore. We want to have something to rest on. We need to plan for it. So some people listen to this, they look at this and say, I can't even pay today's bills. How am I going to be able to pay tomorrow's? Yes, for some situations that's going to be a challenge. But if we as a community would have that as a trend, the trend of being able to live down in order to be able to save for the future, I think it's a culture-changing mindset. It's certainly not the mindset of the present. It's certainly not the way things are being done now. People instead figure out how much they can borrow, how much the bank will let them borrow, how much their budget of today will allow them to borrow, rather than thinking what it's going to be, what they're going to need in the future, what it's going to be like. Right? The house poor who buy big houses before they're paying tuitions and things like that for their children. So satisfaction, not just living within our means, but building happiness and satisfaction with this stuff. And number two, instead of borrowing, saving so that borrowing doesn't have to happen. A mindset change internally. And finally, and this is the most important for it all, and on this I would like to dwell a little bit more, and a little bit more time. And that is, we have to create within ourselves, when we talk about the thing of not feeling a need to keep up, we have to create within ourselves a sense of leadership rather than followership. We can't be looking over our shoulders. We can't be figuring out what the next person is doing and therefore follow suit. The trends in our community build very, very quickly and very strongly. Personally, one way that in our family we avoid the trends is that, I know this sounds funny, but we don't read Jewish newspapers. We don't read Jewish newspapers. Any Jewish newspaper that comes without advertisements, we're happy to read. But otherwise, we don't read Jewish newspapers because the needs of the present and of the future are constantly being promoted there. And it's overwhelming. And the trends, just go outside and look and see how powerful it is in our tale of one city, the best of times and the worst of times, what kind of expectations and pressures this creates on us if we feel we have to follow, if we're looking at what's there and how we have to respond to it. The raising of standards in terms of the kinds of stuff that we can buy, as opposed to making it ourselves, doing it for ourselves. It's wonderful to have options when people are able to afford the options, when people don't forfeit the abilities and the work ethic that will be able to enable one to live without having the option, where one is able to treat the option as a treat rather than as a new standard and as a new necessity. But it's galloping. It's huge. It's huge, the amount of followership which is happening when it comes to matters of spending. And it behooves everyone to live within their means. But I would also suggest we don't legislate. On occasion, attempts are made to legislate, and they've accomplished sometimes something. Even though they failed as legislation, they've accomplished something. There was the chasana takonas, right? Where they made rules once upon a time. I don't know how long ago it was, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. A wedding can only have A, B, C, and D. Otherwise, we will not attend the wedding. And the wedding didn't follow rule A, B, and C, and D. People still attended the wedding. The failure of legislation. But on the other hand, as a result of saying that, many people got the guts and the courage to say, hey, I'm going to make that wedding. I'm going to make the wedding they said it should have, without hot this and without all those many pieces and so on and so forth. And I can proudly say, I'm making a wedding according to the way people said that the wedding should be made. It lowered possibilities, it lowered expectations. And it wasn't only the thing which people who couldn't do better hid behind, but sometimes people who could do more nevertheless chose. We have one example of a takana in the Gemara. It was not a wedding takana, it was a funeral takana. In fact, it wasn't a takana. It wasn't a rule which was created. Now it's a rule. What was the rule? The non-rule rule. People had funerals. They would dress the person who died in a tuxedo. They'd have a beautiful box and everything else. It was a really nice affair. And what happened was, when their relatives died, people would run away. They'd abandon them if they couldn't afford it. They couldn't afford the band. They couldn't afford the box, the coffin with a Bose stereo inside. So they abandoned them. And the Gemara says, so one of the sages who was wealthy, who could afford it, said, when I die, bury me in a simple cloth. And there went the trend. Because there was a leader who said, there goes the trend. I think that those who are tempted to follow need to learn how to lead, how to understand what our means are, and to live accordingly. There's nothing more enjoyable or more empowering than that. And those who are able to do more can also lead, can lead by bringing it down a notch, by showing that even though I could do more, but I'm going to do less. I want to bridge the gap. We live together. We live with each other. Let's try. A person may, this is not a mandate, it's an opportunity. It's not a responsibility that people have, that this is what you must do. But it's an opportunity, it's a possibility. And imagine if someone doing that succeeded in starting a trend that in this way would relieve the pressure to dress this way, to decorate this way, to simchaize this way, to drive this way. Ultimately, the challenge of money is a challenge of happiness. It's a challenge of happiness. In Svarim, in many sources, it notes that the term kesef, which is the term for money, is the term, same word which means kisufin. Kisufin are yearnings, the things which we yearn for, the things which we strive for. Money often is the ultimate striving for the things that money can buy, which is why it becomes the tool for frustration, because failed yearnings are the core element of that which creates frustration. And what we really yearn for, more than anything else, what we yearn for is happiness. I always used to tell my kids, for whatever reason, I have a nicer car today, nothing to do with me. But I used to have a car that I was even more proud of. It was like 20 years old, and it was neat, mostly until the end. And it was neat, and it ran. I put in gas twice a year. It was fine. And I would tell my kids, and I really mean it, I said, this car, me driving this car is much more comfortable than me driving the fanciest car in the world. And the reason is because, okay, I get some bumps on the road, but I drive around knowing that I paid for it already. Because, the anxiety of a $300 monthly payment, the extra burden which it puts on to be able to have that smoother ride, I'll take the bumps any day. Any day. And the need to constantly figure out what I'm going to do next, what I'm going to do more, even if I have it. The desire, the ultimate desire of every human being is to be happy. The reason why the financial issue is the issue that it is because of how it is affecting the happiness of individuals, of families, of children within families, of breadwinners who feel that they are failing. So while the solutions, the ideas presented here are simple, old ideas, but they're the core of the issue. They're the shift of the kisufin, of the yearning, from more to the shift of the yearning for happiness and satisfaction. And so much of that, not all of it, again, there are circumstances, extremes which are beyond our control, but so much of it is, in a great sense, man-made. Something that we are in a position to do more about. And I encourage each and every one of us, whichever end of the spectrum we find ourselves on, to think and to consider what we can do in our hands to substitute the yearning for happiness and for joy as the primary yearning that allows the other things to be able to fall into place. I hope you found this somewhat practical, and I welcome your suggestions about the next phase of the discussion, which will be a little bit more macro and directly macro, but I welcome your suggestions and your input so we can use this time as well as possible and as productively as possible. Thank you. Have a good day.